Nicolás Kicker. Born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Nicolás Kicker worked his way up the hard way through Futures and Challenger tournaments, far from the spotlight of the ATP Tour. By the mid-2010 seconds, he was right on the edge of the big stage, qualifying for Grand Slam main draws, climbing the rankings, and earning a reputation as one of the hardest working players on tour. His career seemed steady, predictable, moving step by step toward the top 50. But in 2018, that line suddenly broke. An investigation by tennis integrity officials revealed that several of Kicker's challenger-level matches had been fixed. These weren't glamorous center court matches with packed crowds and TV cameras. They were played on the outskirts of the tennis world, where the money is small, the pressure is constant, and survival often feels like the only goal. And in those shadows, temptation sits much closer than it appears. Investigators found a pattern: specific matches, specific moments, and betting odds that shifted in ways too perfect to be coincidence. To the average fan, it was just numbers on a screen. But for a struggling player, it could mean enough money to pay for travel, coaching, or another season on tour. For tennis itself, though, it meant something much worse: a crack in trust that echoes louder than any applause. The punishment was decisive: a long suspension, loss of ranking, and permanent damage to his reputation. A career built over years collapsed into a few pages of official reports and cold legal phrases. And it's important to remember, this isn't a story of a villain, it's a story of a choice. A choice that begins quietly with a message, a connection, a promise of easy money, and ends loudly, with bans, headlines, and a stain that never fully disappears. Why is this case so important? Because Kicker wasn't a superstar, but he wasn't a nobody either. He represents an entire class of professionals stuck between ambition and survival, talented enough to dream, but too underfunded to stay clean from temptation. His story exposes the fragile economy of lower-level tennis: endless travel, minimal prize money, and careers hanging on a few lucky weeks. And beyond all that, it leaves a lesson. Tennis is built on trust, between players, fans, and the sport itself. One manipulated game can cost more than any victory ever earned. And if we really want to understand how careers rise and fall, we have to look not only at the center courts, but into the shadows where sometimes the fate of a match is decided long before the first serve. Daniele Bracciali. A name once tied to talent and resilience that later became a symbol of Italian tennis's fall from grace. Born in Arezzo, Daniele Bracciali came from the old school of players, not the fastest or flashiest, but smart, precise, and patient. By the early 2000s, he was climbing steadily: ATP titles, a spot inside the top 30, appearances in every Grand Slam. In doubles, he became a real threat. His serve and court sense made him a reliable force among the elite. But even as his career grew, something darker was forming in the shadows. In 2007, early rumors surfaced about his involvement in suspicious betting activity. Back then, it ended with a warning. But in 2014, things got serious. Italian prosecutors released private chats, deals, betting codes, numbers, amounts. For many, it was a shock. This wasn't a random futures player. This was a national team member, a respected professional. The ITF and the Italian Federation had no choice but to act. First came a temporary suspension, then a lifetime ban. Then came appeals, hearings, partial reductions. But the stain never left. The shadow of a player who stood at the top and fell into temptation. This story was never really about money. Bracciali earned enough. It was about self-deception, that dangerous thought. One time won't change anything. But it did. It changed everything. A reputation built over years collapsed into headlines and court rulings. Fans turned away. Teammates went silent. Eventually, Bracciali came back. After years of legal battles, he returned to the court, older, calmer, still precise. There was something symbolic about it. A man who once lost to his own choices picking up the racket again, trying to prove that tennis still meant more to him than his mistake ever could. Daniele Bracciali is a reminder that even success offers no protection from downfall when a player forgets where the game ends and greed begins. Grigor Sargsyan. He never won a title. He never played on a center court. He never lifted a trophy. And yet, he stood at the center of one of the biggest scandals in tennis history. Grigor Sargsyan, a name tennis didn't learn from a scoreboard, but from police reports. Born in Armenia, living in Belgium, Sargsyan built a shadow empire through the mid-2000s in 10 seconds, an empire founded on match fixing. According to investigators, dozens of players passed through his hands, from unknown futures participants to ATP Challenger regulars. He didn't threaten them, he tempted them with money, security, and the illusion of mutual benefit. For players living on the financial edge of the tour, that offer sounded impossible to ignore. Sargsyan wasn't just a middleman, he was an architect, the mastermind behind a perfectly synchronized operation. Private Telegram chats, coded messages, bets placed across continents in the same minute. His network spread from Europe to South America. And when the Washington Post published its 2023 investigation, the world saw the scale of it. Over a few short years, his system had turned tennis into one of the most profitable tools of illegal betting. He never appeared on camera, but he controlled results. They called him the Maestro, the man who played tennis not with a racket, but with people. When he was finally arrested, investigators found phones, chat logs, and a list of hundreds of fixed matches involving professional players. Some of them are still competing today, others simply vanished. The story of Grigor Sargsyan is a mirror reflecting the dark side of sport. When gambling becomes bigger than the game, a new economy emerges. Players, bookies, fixers, and one man pulling the strings. He never won a tournament, but he may have shaped the outcome of hundreds. And most importantly, he exposed how fragile tennis really is. Not because players are weak, but because the system itself leaves too many shadows to hide in. Grigor Sargsyan became the face of that darkness, a reminder that wherever there's money and pressure, someone will always try to buy the result. Karim Hossam. He was supposed to be Egypt's first true representative on the global tennis stage. By the mid-2010 seconds, Karim Hossam had become a symbol of hope for an entire region, energetic, technical, and intelligent, with the potential to make history. He climbed the rankings, won futures titles, and represented Egypt in the Davis Cup. In a country where tennis was still seen as an elite sport, his name was an inspiration. But behind that rise, another story was unfolding, one that no one wanted to see. Hossam lived on the edge of professional tennis, where prize money often doesn't even cover the cost of getting to the next tournament. Futures, events, cheap hotels, flights across continents, all paid out of pocket. And when someone offers to help, the line between support and corruption becomes dangerously thin. An investigation by the Tennis Integrity Unit uncovered that Hossam was part of a large network where players agreed on scores and points for money. Several of his matches on the futures and challenger circuits were fixed. In 2018, he received a lifetime ban for multiple offenses, including organizing match fixing for others. For Egyptian tennis, it was a disaster. The player who was meant to inspire a generation became an example of how the system itself can break people. To some, he was not a criminal, but a symptom. A talented athlete left without guidance, trapped in a tour where survival often depends on saying yes. Hossam's story isn't just about one man. It's about an entire class of players the sport barely notices. At the top, there are sponsors, coaches, and first-class flights. Below that, hundreds of professionals living tournament to tournament, one bad week away from financial collapse. That's where the schemes are born, out of silence, pressure, and debt. Karim Hossam remains a controversial figure. For some, a cheater. For others, a warning sign. He wasn't forgiven, but he wasn't forgotten. His downfall was the first major alarm bell. Match fixing in tennis isn't an accident, it's a pattern. And until the lower levels of the sport stop living in poverty, stories like his will keep repeating. Youssef Hossam. If Karim Hossam was the symbol of Egypt's lost tennis hope, his younger brother Youssef became the symbol of a future that never happened. He was the one people called the new face of Arab tennis. Young, charismatic, and gifted, Youssef was part of the next-gen ATP list in 2017, standing among the best juniors in the world. Journalists wrote that Egypt would finally have a true ATP-level player, but instead of a breakthrough, the world witnessed another scandal. An investigation by the Tennis Integrity Unit revealed that Youssef was involved in more than 20 separate match-fixing incidents. He wasn't just participating, he was helping to coordinate them. Sometimes as a messenger, sometimes as an organizer. The pattern was familiar: low-level futures tournaments, no cameras, barely any spectators, where every point could be sold for a few $100s. In 2020, the International Tennis Integrity Agency issued Youssef Hossam a lifetime ban. He was only 21 years old. His career ended before it had even truly begun. The story hit hard because Youssef wasn't just another struggling player. He was the promise, a representative of the ATP's Next Gen initiative, a role model for young players across the Middle East. And that's what made his fall so devastating. He wasn't fighting for survival, he was already standing at the door of the elite. Why did he do it? The answer is complicated. Yes, money played a part, but perhaps it was also the shadow of his brother's story, the constant travel, the fatigue, or just the belief that he could get away with it. Youssef Hossam became the face of a new problem, not poverty, but cynicism. When young players see that punishment comes slowly and profit comes fast, temptation becomes a lifestyle. And that's how a new generation emerges, not as victims, but as willing participants in a broken system. Today, Youssef Hossam's name is tied forever to disgrace. But his story is more than a personal downfall, it's a warning. Because when cheating becomes routine, talent no longer matters. Enrique Lopez Perez. Spain, a country where tennis is almost a religion, where every generation dreams of following Nadal's path, and the word honor means as much as victory. That's why the story of Enrique Lopez Perez hit Spanish tennis so hard. Lopez Perez was never a superstar, but he was respected. By 2017, he had reached the top 200, played in Australian Open qualifiers, and even represented Spain in the Davis Cup. He was part of a system built on professionalism and reputation. But behind that clean surface, another story was taking shape. An ITIA investigation uncovered 3 fixed matches played at challenger-level tournaments in 2017. They weren't high-profile finals, no TV cameras, no crowds. Just quiet weekday matches, the kind no one would ever notice, if not for sudden betting spikes moments before play began. When analysts traced the odds, the pattern was clear. Lopez Perez had received an offer, and he took it. In 2020, the ITIA handed him an 8-year suspension. A man who had devoted his life to tennis was now banned from it entirely. He was only 30 years old. He denied the allegations, but the evidence spoke louder than his defense. For Spanish tennis, it wasn't just a scandal, it was a warning. Even in nations with strong systems, perfect facilities, and financial security, temptation still exists. Because the problem isn't geography, it's human nature. No matter how much you earn, easy money will always sound louder than slow effort. One game, one set, one decision, that's all it takes to erase a reputation. David Guez. French tennis has always been about elegance, technique, intelligence, and artistry. But in the 2010 seconds, one name became a reminder that even beauty can have a darker side. David Guez, a player who spent years in the shadows, a quiet professional in a system that seemed to function perfectly. He was never a star, but he was reliable. Ranked inside the top 120, a regular at Grand Slams, a solid challenger competitor, fans knew his name but rarely remembered his matches. He was always close to the elite, but never quite there. And maybe that's what made him vulnerable. By 2017, his career was fading. Age, injuries, fewer wins, smaller prize money, and even less motivation. That's when his name appeared in connection with the network run by Grigor Sargsyan, the same man who turned match fixing into a global business. Leaked messages and betting data linked Guez to pre-arranged matches, each with a fixed payout. He wasn't a desperate teenager. He wasn't new to the sport. He understood the system, and that made his involvement even more unsettling. When the Washington Post published its investigation into the Maestro Network in 2023, it revealed something chilling. Among the dozens of players caught up in the scheme were veterans players once seen as steady, trustworthy professionals. For French tennis, it was a blow to its reputation. Guez belonged to a generation raised on Federer and Gasquet, a generation that valued style over profit. But even that generation had cracks. David Guez was never arrested. He didn't give interviews, didn't defend himself, didn't make noise. He simply disappeared. His name stayed in the reports, but not on the scoreboard. And maybe that's how his story ends in silence. A quiet consequence for everything that was once played off the books. Denis Istomin. A name millions of fans remember for one of the greatest upsets in Australian Open history. Melbourne, 2017 second round. The world stood still as the 117th ranked player in the world defeated Novak Djokovic, the defending champion and world number 1. That day, Denis Istomin became a hero, a symbol of everything that makes sport unpredictable, magical, and alive. His victory was proof that, for one day, anything is possible. But a few years later, his name began appearing in a different kind of headline, the kind no athlete ever wants to see. Some of his matches, both on the Challenger circuit and the ATP Tour, were flagged as suspicious by betting monitors. The Tennis Integrity Unit recorded unusual shifts in betting odds just minutes before play began. No official charges were ever filed, but the shadow was already cast. For a player of his caliber, that shadow is worse than a suspension. When your matches are discussed not for your wins, but for betting patterns, your reputation begins to erode quietly, without a trial, without a chance to defend yourself. And once that trust is gone, it never fully returns. Istomin always denied any involvement. He continued to compete, to represent Uzbekistan in the Davis Cup, and remained an inspiration for young players across Asia. But in many eyes, his story became a metaphor for how easy it is to become suspicious and how impossible it is to clear your name once you are. This story matters not because it's about guilt, but because it's about fragility. Tennis is built on trust. In the score, the serve, the handshake. And when even one honest player falls under suspicion, the entire sport feels the loss. Denis may have done nothing wrong, but his name now sits beside hundreds of others, not in highlight reels, but in reports read by investigators. And that's the real tragedy. Sometimes, you don't have to break the rules to lose your reputation. Alexander Dolgopolov. For those who watched tennis in the 2010 seconds, his name meant style and freedom. Dolgopolov wasn't just a player. He was an artist with a racket. Fluid movement, unpredictable shots, lightning instincts. He was the kind of player fans loved even in defeat. He beat Nadal, battled Federer, broke into the top 20. Ukrainian tennis hadn't seen charisma like his in years. But in 2017, his name surfaced in reports from the Tennis Integrity Unit alongside the words unusual betting activity. One of his matches had triggered a spike in betting markets. Odds shifted minutes before play began, and analysts marked it as an anomaly. No formal charges followed, but the damage was already done. Headlines were printed. Reputations don't wait for verdicts. Dolgopolov denied everything, saying the system was flawed, that numbers aren't proof. Yet from that moment on, his name carried a quiet parenthesis, under suspicion. And for an athlete who built his career on admiration, that was the cruelest sentence of all. He later stepped away from tennis, turning to other projects, and when war came to Ukraine, he returned home this time as a volunteer, not a competitor. But the trace of that story never left him, not because he was guilty, but because the internet never forgets. The story of Dolgopolov isn't about crime. It's about fragility, about how thin the line is between perception and truth, and how fast a fan favorite can become a name in an investigation. He didn't lose ranking points. He wasn't fined. He wasn't convicted, but he lost something rarer than trophies trust. And maybe that's why his story feels like one of the saddest in tennis, because sometimes innocence just isn't loud enough. Danilo Petrovic. For those who rarely watch tennis outside the ATP Tour, his name might not mean much. But in the world of challengers and futures, Danilo Petrovic was a familiar face, a strong, disciplined Serbian professional known for his serve, his composure, and his consistency. He wasn't chasing fame, he was just working. He played on every continent, won challenger titles, and proudly represented Serbia in the Davis Cup. A classic example of the sport's silent majority, the hardworking players who keep tennis alive below the spotlight. But it's often among players like him that match-fixing stories begin. Because here, prize money runs out faster than the season does. Every injury threatens to end a career. And when someone shows up offering help or extra income, morality quietly turns into a question of survival. An investigation by the International Tennis Integrity Agency found that Petrovic had been involved in several suspicious matches, mostly at challenger events in 2019 and 2020. The betting odds shifted too sharply to ignore, and later it became clear the offers were real. In 2021, he was suspended and fined for breaching the sport's anti-corruption code. The story barely made the news. No press conferences, no statements, no broken rackets. Just a quiet disappearance from the system. Another player erased, leaving behind only a single line in a disciplinary report. And yet, that silence says everything. Big tennis rarely notices when these careers collapse. They fade away quietly. But together, they form the statistics that define the sport's growing crisis. Danilo Petrovic wasn't a villain. He was part of a system where fair play often costs more than a win. And maybe that's what his story reminds us, that match fixing isn't always about greed. Sometimes it's about survival.